Hi, this is Jackie. I'm your lecturer for the Birth Institute, and I'm going to be covering anatomy and physiology today. This is our first lesson of the midwifery sciences, and I'm just going to have a brief look at what you've been reading. It's very dry material, and you're probably thinking, why do I need to know about cell structure and respiration? I'm studying midwifery. But you need to know it to be able to relate physiology specifically, and then as well, of course, anatomy, because the body changes in shape during pregnancy, as it relates to a woman when she's pregnant, also for her developing fetus and when it's a newborn, and very much so as well for her labour and birth and her recovery and general well-being. You need to know these basics, and it's fascinating when you get to understand how the body works. It's magical. And as Albert Einstein said, there are only two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle, and the other is as though everything is a miracle. And anatomy and physiology is pretty miraculous when you get to know it. Anatomy is the form, and physiology is the function. And basically, everything is made up of cells. All living things are made from cells. Plants are single-celled, animals multi-billion-celled, and humans apparently 100 trillion-celled. And each cell has its own structure. And in the cell structure, and you can see the image here, that's really important just to get a look at that image and work out what is all in there. But it suffice to say that a cell is made up of three sections, which is important to know. It's the cell membrane, the nucleus, and then between the two is the cytoplasm, where all the bits and pieces and the important stuff also is. But most importantly to know is that in the nucleus of the cell is where the genetic material that regulates and is stored, and the nucleus of the cell also regulates the activities of the cell. And when we have a group of cells, because they're minuscule, they're microscopic, that come together, that forms tissue, and tissue forms an organ, and a set of organs forms an organ system, and so forth. So it kind of all just builds up from there, and cells are really where it starts. And then we have different kinds of body tissue. We have the epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous tissue. And you need to have a look at basically what those tissues do. One is the covering, one is the connective, it binds the structures together. Muscular tissue is very special tissue, which is comprised of cells that are able to shorten and lengthen in contraction and expansion to be able to have us function. And remember this, because the uterus is also an enormous muscle tissue cell component, and that functions completely differently in the shortening and contracting function that it has. And we'll get to that eventually when we get to birth. But remember that the uterus is also comprised of muscle tissue. The body membranes are thin sheets of tissue which cover the body. They line the body cavities and cover organs. And we have the mucous membranes, the serosum membranes, the synovial, and the meninges, which you'll see come back again in your nervous system overview. Important to know that egg and sperm cells are produced by a very special type of nuclear division, which is called meiosis, in which the chromosomes are halved, which is the whole reason that they're halved is that when the egg and the sperm come together, then fertilization takes place. We're going to discuss that next week. And then from those 23 chromosomes on each side, 46 are formed, and so that is a healthy, normal human being. And We will also look at what happens when that doesn't go well. Importantly, the body has its own, very, very own mechanism, controlled and communicated and organized by various organ systems. And the most important organ system that creates homeostasis is actually your endocrine system, which are your hormones, but also your nervous system, because the nervous system sends the messages. And your body is very able, with how its systems work, to create homeostasis. And I like this picture on the right because we're going to talk about the nervous system because it's very important to know as a midwife. But this shows that the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system, how they work in opposition to each other. One is the healing, the restoration, the rest, that balance, and the other is the fight, flight, activity, stress side, and we're going to get back to that. But there is a way that the body is able to balance that, and the homeostasis is done by and or is created by the sensory receptors, integrators, and effectors, which basically means the senses sense that something is out of balance. It goes to be integrated, and then, like in the brain, and then something happens to create a balance. So it can be a nerve ending that gives the message. The brain says, oops, that finger's on a hot plate, and then the effector is the muscle. Or if it was a gland, that pulls back and says, create homeostasis, this is not balanced. Burning your finger is not a balanced situation, of course. And so the body is beautifully made to do that. And one of the main systems that will play a huge role in that is the nervous system. It's the major regulatory, communicating, and controlling system in the body. It's where all the mental activity is done, including thought and learning and memory and me being able to speak, doing this lesson, for instance. And together with the endocrine system, and the endocrine system is the system that makes hormones, the nervous system helps create that homeostasis. The nervous system is comprised of organs, as most systems are. The brain, which is in the skull, the cranium, the spinal cord, the nerves that go from the spinal cord, through the spinal cord and from the spinal cord, and the ganglia. And if you look at this image, you'll see the brain housing right at the top, the absolutely beautiful spinal cord, and how the nerves run through in the spinal cord, encased in a beautiful membrane and fluid. And then the nerves run from there, feeding the organs with impulses to be able to do what they need to do. Think of the heart, that it needs to pump. And also sending back messages to the brain to create that homeostasis. For instance, you're walking through the forest and you out of the corner of your eye you see a snake. I'm South African, so it's got to be a snake. The reaction that happens is both physical but also in the brain, that trigger that sends adrenaline, that helps, there's danger, that helps your muscles get more blood to them, and that helps you take a huge sprint in the opposite direction. So those messages, to be able to do that, for me to be able to be doing this with my hands up and down, is regulated by the nervous system. So if you have a look at it in a schematic form, central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, then the peripheral nervous system, the nerves and the spinal, the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves, and then that is split up. You have messages coming from the brain to the muscles, and messages from the muscles and the environment coming to the brain. So the afferent and the efferent. Most of the efferent are muscle and gland responses. Now, the motor nervous system is split up into two: the somatic nervous system, the voluntary impulses and responses that happen, and then the autonomic nervous system, the ANS, which are the involuntary motor responses, like your heart beating. You can influence that, get a fright or become excited, and your heartbeat will increase, or the muscles and glands can be influenced by smelling something delicious, and so your salivary glands will be set off. So that's what you have to think of, what's happening there. Now, most importantly, the autonomic nervous system is split up into two: the sympathetic division, which is your fright flight, and the parasympathetic division. And I'm just going to look at what the autonomic nervous system, what the function is, and then we're going to split that up and look at those two nervous systems, because they're very, very important to know when working with pregnancy, but especially during labour and birth. So the involuntary visceral bodily functions, so cardiovascular, respiratory, digestion, urinary, reproductive, and of course a key role in the body's response to stress. But the not stress side is the parasympathetic nervous system, and that is the system that helps digestion, mobility, that smooth muscle mobility through your digestion, resistance to infection, the rest and recuperation. So when you're sleeping at night, that parasympathetic nervous system is in full tilt and is helping you to restore. The endorphins are being made. Your feel-good hormones are made via the parasympathetic nervous system. And those hormones are hormones that we're going to hear a lot about during our midwifery journey. It also decreases heart rate, blood pressure, temperature. If you think of when you're lying down for a while, even though it's warm, you will cool down because that parasympathetic nervous system kicks in and cools you down. So it's really your rest and recuperation. And very importantly, it kicks in during birth. Bam. And keep that in mind. You're going to love that. Well, I love that whole section when we get to birth and the nervous system. Importantly to know then, on the other side of the scale, the sympathetic nervous system stimulates. So the parasympathetic actually decreases the heartbeat, so it is non-stimulating, and the parasympathetic nervous system stimulates. It increases the heart rate, it kind of gets the body ready for action, increases release of sugar, energy for your muscles, and it gets you ready for that flight, fight, the snake in the corner of your eye. Reaction. It's in constant opposition to the parasympathetic nervous system. It's kind of one or the other. So you can think of how influential having stress is to your digestion, for instance. And think about stress and heart failure. We know that's also nutrition, but it's if that heart has to beat a lot harder and a lot faster, then it's just not going to cope. Because the parasympathetic system just has to lay low. And of course it kicks in the sympathetic nervous system when we get to having stress.